Welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV, the live TV show all about the legal aspects of your business to help educate you on complex legal terms in an easy to understand manner, to help understand why you need to do certain things in your business from a legal point of view, and to help you develop a plan for the future. Our mission at Business Legal Lifecycle is to help empower all small to medium-sized businesses around the world to get access to legal advice so that they can help build their communities and make the world a better place. Did you know that any business owner is on average 7 months away from losing everything? That is the average time it takes from a successful business to fold when an aspect of their business is not set up correctly. Have you ever wanted to get legal advice but didn't understand what was going on? Do you feel like there is a divide between lawyers and their clients? Then this TV show is for you. It is all about empowering you and your business with the knowledge and tools to ensure that this doesn't happen to you. Business Legal Lifecycle TV delivers a twice-weekly show focusing on the legal aspects of your business. At lunchtime on Mondays, we present Fast Fix Monday, a quick 5 to 10 minute show that will give you some actionable steps to consider for the week for your business. And at lunchtime on Wednesdays, we present our in-depth show of between 30 minutes and an hour, where we go through complicated legal aspects of your business in a simple to understand, plain English manner. And whether that is through educational pieces or interviews with experts in their fields.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV. Today is our special, the part of the Accountants Partnership Plus series that we're doing today. So, as always, I'm Craig Mason, and with me I have the other founder of the Business Legal Lifecycle, Jeremy. You want to say hello to everyone, Jeremy?
Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a good day.
Excellent. So today, for, as I said, the Accountants Partnership Plus, we're looking at franchising and starting a franchise, and the sorts of things that you need to think about when you're, talking to clients that are thinking about starting a franchise. We're going to go through some certain things that we think they need to consider and that you need to consider as their advisor. So, as I said, we're going to be talking about starting a franchise and what you need to have in place in order to do that. So, Jeremy, you're going to start off today's episode.
Yeah.
There should be some slides coming up on the screen now, I think.
Yeah, I've put them up there. I've got the title card. So it's called Starting a Franchise, part of our Accountants Partnership Plus program, and what you need to have in place. So for anyone who is watching this on our Facebook page, YouTube, or Periscope, please watch the slides and see the information. If you are listening to the podcast, because we do syndicate this as part of our Business Legal Lifecycle podcast, then feel free to jump onto our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in Business Legal Lifecycle and you'll find us, and you'll be able to see copies of these slides. There's not a great deal of information in the slides, but they just give you an idea and an overview of what we are talking about. So I've flicked over to the second slide, which is the Business Legal Lifecycle itself. And you'll see that we've got the slide with the picture up of Business Legal Lifecycle up until phase 7. And phase 7 is all about franchising, expansion, and licensing. Now, we're going to talk about a few different topics today. We're going to talk about what is franchising. We're going to talk about what the time to franchise is, and that'll come back to the Business Legal Lifecycle in some respects. We're going to talk about the franchising code of conduct, and then I'm going to close off by talking about the disclosure statement. Craig's then going to talk about franchisees and what to look out for there. He's going to talk about the manual and what should be in place for the manual. He's going to talk a little bit about licensing and the difference between licensing and franchising, because that's very important, and it's very important that you understand. And finally, we're going to talk through some common mistakes that we see in franchises and in franchise agreements from time to time. So the last one of these that we did was based on a franchisee's point of view, and that's in phase 2 startup. This one is phase 7. And as I said, I'll talk about in time to franchise what you need to have in place before you franchise. So without further ado, we'll get into what is franchising. What is franchising? A franchise isn't necessarily a written document, and the definition of what a franchise is quite a broad definition. And the reason for that is that wants to encapsulate everything that you can have in relation to a franchise, because a lot of people want to get out of franchises, and you'll see why when we talk about what the difference is with licensing, the costs of compliance, the costs of what you need to do in the franchising code of conduct. It's a very popular game that a lot of business owners try to play to avoid a franchise by getting out and making it a license, but that's very difficult. So a franchise is essentially can be a written document, it can be implied, and it can be verbal. And it essentially, what it is, it's where you license the use of intellectual property to a third party. If you do that license and you want to have any control over the business, it's probably a franchise. Now that might seem a bit general, but the decisions, the case law, and all this stuff is pretty clear that if it looks and smells like a franchise, it probably is a franchise. So you got to be really careful and not fall into the trap of trying to avoid having a franchise because the law is very broad on what a franchise is. It's very broad on the definition, and there are some heavy penalties that come in if you try to get around a franchise and you don't actually have one, or you actually have a franchise and you're trying to get away without having one. And so those penalties can be the franchisee can get out of the agreement. You can be fined, and in extreme cases there are even some criminal punishments if you're found to be doing that. But that's very unlikely that you're going to get that. So what you really need to be wary of is what kind of control does your client have over the people that they're trying to license the intellectual property to? Because if they've got any sort of control, it's probably a franchise, and you probably need to advise them to be cautious and not go down that path. So time to franchise is the second slide. And you'll remember, and I'll bring it up just quickly, the business legal lifecycle again. There are 13 phases of the business legal lifecycle. And as you can see from this graphic, there are 6 phases before this phase. And those are things like protecting IP, bringing on employees, initial clients. And the reason that all of this is important is when it's time to franchise, you need to have all of this stuff in place first. You need to spend the time and the effort to get your systems and processes in place, because at the end of the day, that's what people are buying when they buy your franchise. Now, it's very important to remember that not every business needs to franchise their business. Not every business owner is right to franchise. A franchise is a separate business. And I think that's something that a lot of people who set up franchises and see the shiny object in the future miss, is the fact that they're operating a separate business. And that separate business needs to be worked on just as much as any other business. It's going to need employees. You're going to need to be looking at a lot of other aspects of the business. So if you've got a client who's looking at franchising, they need to look at, is it right for them? And do they have the time to spend in the business? Because if they don't, then there's no point in going through into a franchise. And I could give you hundreds of horror stories where franchisors have gone into franchises without the time to actually spend in the franchise. There are cases of well-known franchises that have been sold to well-known groups because the owner just couldn't maintain the franchise business as well as their regular business, because it is a large investment of time. So you need to have all your systems and processes set up correctly, and we're going to talk about some of those today. Craig's going to talk about the manual, and I'll talk about some of the stuff that you need to have in place for the franchising code of conduct. But you need to have all your systems in place, and you need to have the right mindset, and not just you're going to end up with customers and franchisees if you just go at it without much thought put into. So putting those critical thinking and the critical considerations in place are very important before you go franchising, so that and your clients go franchising, so that they get the right processes in place before they go ahead. All right, so that's the time to franchise. The next one is the franchising code of conduct. So the franchising code of conduct is a code of conduct that has been set in place by legislation. And the legislation is the Competition and Consumer Act. It used to be part of the Trade Practices Act. And what it does is it actually sets out and says that we've got this franchising code of conduct. You have to comply with it. And if you don't, then there are penalties for non-compliance. And the penalties can be things such as fines, letting the franchisee out of the franchise. So the code of conduct sets out a bunch of different things, and it's something that's very important that if you've got a franchise agreement, and I've got an example, an old client of ours who had problems in his business. He had problems with his franchisees, and his whole business was surrounded around those. But he never read his franchise agreement. He never read his franchise code of conduct. He never read his disclosure statement. He relied upon his lawyers to make sure that it was right. And as lawyers, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what could go into an agreement. We don't know where it might go and the nuances of his business. Now, when he came to see me, he'd been operating his business for about 15 years. And he had 20 pages of notes of changes based on just reading the documentation and getting an understanding of what it actually meant and where it was going in his business. And that's just one example of a client who really should have read the franchising code of conduct, because he found out so much more than he would have realized otherwise. So the franchising code of conduct is very important. As I said before, non-compliance means, in most cases, that the franchisee can get out of the franchise. It can also mean that the franchisee gets penalties. There can be misrepresentation cases. You can lose hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars by not setting this up correctly. So if you've got clients who are considering not setting up a franchise and not complying with the franchising code of conduct because they don't want to pay those pesky lawyers so much money to set them up, you need to talk to them about the costs of non-compliance and make sure they understand what actually happens. The buck stops with us as consultants to make sure that our clients understand what they do, but ultimately the buck stops with the client. We need to advise them, make sure that they understand what their risks are, and if they choose to go ahead anyway, well, they choose to go ahead anyway. We can't stop them from doing it, but we need to advise them of the risks. And the risks, if you don't comply with the franchising code of conduct, are huge. And the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, will take no end in joy in coming after dodgy franchisors or what they perceive to be dodgy franchisors. So that's the franchising code of conduct. Probably the most important part of the franchising code of conduct is the disclosure statement. So the disclosure statement is a document that is prescribed in the franchising code of conduct, and it's a bunch of information that you need to disclose to your franchisees as a franchisor about the business and about what your business actually is and what it does. The disclosure statement is probably the hardest part to get right because there's so many nuances and different information. I'm going to go through some of the important points that you need to make sure you cover off in the disclosure statement and to understand what the different implications are and different information. So the first thing is the history of the franchisee. You need to give the history of the franchise, not the franchisee, the franchise and the franchisor. So, often a franchise will have been operating for 10, 15 years, and you want to have the history out there and also the business experience of the franchisor and its directors. So that's really important so that the franchisee understands who they're going into business with, because this is a business relationship, remember that. And so the law's there to protect franchisees from unscrupulous franchisors. Litigation history. So a lot of franchises have litigation. It's a natural part of life, unfortunately, for business life. It's something that we see a lot, and you need to disclose, if you're a franchisor, your litigation history. There are rules, there are certain timeframes that you have to comply with, and you have to provide disclosure in relation to certain things. And when I mean things, I mean litigation against the franchisor, litigation against the other franchisees, and litigation with the directors. I've seen plenty of cases where a franchisee has sued their franchisor. Well, if that happens, then they need to disclose, the franchisor needs to disclose that there's litigation on foot, because they need to, as a franchisee, you should know that this kind of litigation has occurred, and you should know that what the ramifications of that might be. Commission payments is another important one. So if the franchisor is paying commission to someone else to help find franchisees, they might be paying commission on products that they're getting. That all has to be disclosed. Another big one, and if you watched our last show, you would have remembered me talking about this, is existing franchisees. So when you have a franchise and you've got, say, 20 franchisees, the franchisor's disclosure statement has to set out all the names, contact details, and territories of the existing franchisees. And the franchisee, the prospective franchisee, has the right to pick up the phone and call each and every one of those people to find out what working with you in a franchise is actually like, and whether or not you keep a hold of and keep true to your promises that you've given. So you've got to set out all their details and make sure that people understand who they are and talk to them. Intellectual property is another massively important one. So this is one that I see all the time where people come to us to set up a franchise and they can't set the franchise up properly because they don't have their intellectual property. They haven't trademarked their business and their business name. That's part of phase 5 of the business legal life cycle, protecting intellectual property and putting all of those things in place to properly protect yourself going forward. So you need to make sure all of that is right and in place before you go into the franchising part of the business legal life cycle. The next one is goods and services. So often you might have a restriction on the ability of a franchisee to be able to get products, goods, and where they get their services from certain suppliers. Those suppliers need to be disclosed, and any, as I said before, any commissions need to be discussed, and also any procedure to go to other suppliers. So the classic example that we heard just yesterday was a franchise of a well-known coffee shop, and they are restricted on where they can buy their tomatoes from. The price of tomatoes has come up here, and they can't afford to put on their products, the tomatoes, at the price level that the franchisor has dictated. So there should be a procedure and a methodology to determine those prices and to make sure that the franchisee can actually operate their business. And this is all stuff that we as consultants need to talk to our franchisee clients about to make sure that they understand what they're buying and what they're getting themselves in for. The next thing is very important is payments. So what payments are you going to have to make to your franchise and to operate your franchise? And this isn't just payments to you as the franchisor or to your client as the franchisor. It's also to all of the other people that you might have to expend money to as part of the franchise. So you need to properly disclose all that information at the time of when you enter into the franchise so that can be properly disclosed going forward. Marketing funds, if you're going to have a marketing budget, you need to disclose that. The law has changed recently and you need to have that fund audited on a regular basis. So if you've got a client with a marketing fund, they need to have it audited so that we can confirm where the money's coming in and out. Arrangements at the end of the franchise is another huge one. You need to disclose what actually happens at the end of a franchise. Let's face it, when you enter into a franchise as a franchisee, you're essentially buying yourself a job for most franchises, except if you go to the big ones. So you need to understand and you need to explain in your franchise disclosure statement and your franchise documentation that that's what's going to happen at the end of the franchise so that the franchisee knows what they're getting at the end, which is usually nothing, but they need to understand that. Details of any cooling off period that might apply. And another huge one is the provision of financial information. So especially where a franchisee is buying a franchise that's an existing franchise, you need to disclose as the franchisor the history of that franchise and what payments have been made and what the income has been so that they can see, the prospective franchisee can see how that business is operated and make sure that they think that they can sustain those levels. And also to get you guys as the accountants looking at that as well, you guys and gals, I should say, looking at that stuff as well, so that you can make sure that you understand everything that is in the business and can properly model the financials for the business going forward. Craig, that's all I had to say on disclosure statements. Before we move on to franchisees, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just a concept that is quite prevalent in this the franchising code of conduct is acting in good faith, and that's something that there's no definition necessarily for that, and it's a test that the court or the ACCC may apply to make sure that the franchisor is acting in good faith, and so you've got to bear that in mind as a franchisor that you're always doing that. The unfair contract legislation also applies to franchise agreements and within the code of conduct as well. So you've got to be wary of that to make sure that your agreements aren't all one-sided. As Jeremy said, there is a power imbalance between a franchisor and a franchisee. So you need to make sure, or the legislation makes sure that it tries to even that up as much as possible. And so you've got to look at good faith. So good faith might be, for example, or acting in not in good faith would be, say the franchisor had an interest in another business, and they allowed that business to enter into the territory of someone that they'd sold a franchise to in a competing type business. That would be seen as acting in or not acting in good faith or acting in bad faith, whatever you want to say. So you just got to bear that in mind when you're a franchisor about acting in good faith. And it's all pretty common sense stuff. Acting in good faith, you know it yourself where you're not acting in good faith, I would have thought. So something to bear in mind if you're talking to someone that's thinking about setting up a franchise business. So.
Yeah, I like to think of it, if it smells like it might be bad faith, or if it makes you feel a bit queasy, it probably is. So yeah, that's a good lesson for people to rely upon.
All right, so moving into franchisees, which is the next slide. Now, when you're looking at franchisees, they're now your new customers. So instead of you having a business where you're selling, coffee or servicing cars, or whatever it might be, your franchisees are now going to be your customers of your franchise. So you've got to sort of change your mindset from that, and you've got to be looking at who do you want to be doing business with, because these are the sorts of people that you're going to have an agreement with for potentially 5-10 years of your franchise business. So you want to make sure you're doing some form of checks and measures on your franchisees to make sure they stack up financially. They're the right sort of people that will follow the model and hopefully have a successful franchise. So you want to do some form of due diligence on these types of people. You don't want to just accept anyone. It's tempting, obviously, to when you're starting out to accept any franchisee into the business, but you want to make sure that you're still checking out to make sure that they're the right sort of people. So don't just accept anyone that's got a checkbook. Do some sort of due diligence. The example is McDonald's. They've got quite a rigorous process before they allow someone to come in as a franchisee, and so obviously you want to model yourself on McDonald's, I guess, depending on what sort of business you're in. But success in these sorts of things leaves clues. They've got an excellent model. You want to make sure that you can follow it where you can. Obviously, one of their great sort of deciding factors as to a franchisee is the costs of entering into a franchise is quite high there, but in other franchises it may not be as high, but you still want to go through the same process to make sure you're getting the right type of franchisee. So, and that's where consultants come in to give that sort of advice about that. You might be looking at their financials and giving some advice about where some things might be falling down or whatever it might be from a prospective franchisee. So, yeah, I guess the moral of the story is make sure you don't just accept everyone and do a bit of checking into different people. So that's franchisees. Moving on to the next slide, Jeremy, which is the manual. So obviously a franchise business, when you sell the particular franchise, you're selling something to a third party that they theoretically should be able to pick up and run the exact same way as the business was previously running. There's going to be consistency across the board. So if someone goes into a Bob's coffee shop in Narangba and someone goes into a Bob's coffee shop in Toogoolawah, it's going to be the same if it's a franchise business, and they expect it to be the same. So as part of that, to make sure everyone follows the process, you need to compile a manual. And we suggest that the manual, the best person to do the manual is the person that's been operating the business, rather than getting someone else to do it. They obviously don't know the day-to-day sort of running and the nuances of a particular business. So the best person to do it's always going to be the actual person that's running the business. You might have other people involved, other consultants involved, to copyright it and those sorts of things, but the actual content should be done by someone that's actually in the business. So in terms of a manual, we have a template table of contents available on the Business Legal Lifecycle website. We can share that link later. And as always...
Craig, we'll put it in the show notes so people can see it there.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. And as always with this as well, obviously if you've got any questions, please ask us. We're here to help. and it mightn't be today, but you might have a question down the track when you've got someone approaching you about a franchise. Please don't hesitate to give us a call and see if we can help out. So in terms of the manual, I encourage you to have a look at the table of contents, but it's going to cover the sorts of things that you'd imagine would be in a manual that's going to operating a business. So there's going to be an introduction to the franchise system, who to call, all those sorts of details, the different areas of the franchise business, those sorts of things. In there, normally there'll be some form of pre-opening type procedures, what licenses, permits, taxes, those sorts of things are relevant, how you're going to run your inventory, setting up bank accounts, what insurance you might need. They might go into, the opening process, as in the first opening, and some form of marketing process for the actual opening, the grand opening, those sorts of things. It would normally then go into, personnel. You've got your employment contracts, the relevant awards, occupational health and safety, those sorts of things will go into there. There might be details in there about the job responsibilities of the particular people you need, a process for recruiting people, interviewing, doing background checks, all of those sorts of things would go in the personnel section. Obviously, what goes with personnel is you need to pay them. There'll be things in there about wages and those sorts of things. Then one of the most important things about it, which makes it consistent as a franchise, is the actual daily operating procedures of the business. So the obvious things in there are going to be the customer service procedures, complaints, those sorts of things, how everyone's greeted, telephone calls, all of that sort of stuff's going to be in there, so you can follow that and make sure it's the same. If it's the type of business that has meal preparation and those sorts of things, then it's going to have the procedures to follow in order to prepare the meals that are the same at Bob's Bakery at Narangba as they will be at Bob's at Toogoolawah. So you want to make sure that all those procedures are in there. That's part of the manual, and that's where the owner of the business or the person operating it becomes particularly relevant. And it's going to go through all sorts of things about the daily operating procedures, the safety, all those sorts of things. It's going to have in there the sales procedures, marketing, so how the marketing is going to be done in your area or in the larger area, and how it's going to normally be done. It might be direct mail, radio, whatever it is. And then also in the manual is going to be all the management type documents and the cash sheets and the policies for holiday leave and all those sorts of things are going to be in there. So you can follow all that, and then if you do that, you'll be operating the franchise the same way as everyone else. So pretty important document. It does take some time. That's probably the thing that's going to take the longest to get sorted. And we'd say to anyone that's thinking about operating a franchise that they need to do the manual. It's going to take a while to get it sort of nailed down to how they want it. It's not going to be an easy process. A lot of people think it's going to be easy to set up a franchise, but the manual part of it's probably one of the hardest things because of the sheer volume of things you need to think about, because it's going to be, everyone's going to have to be able to follow it. So it's got to be pretty clear, and you want them to be able to pick it up and operate it. So yeah, that's the manual. Jeremy, do you want to say anything about the manual?
The only thing I'd say is that there are consultants out there who will offer to write the manual for you. I personally think that's a bad idea. I think that as the business owner, you know what the business needs. You know what needs to operate the business, so you should write it. It's a big job. It is, but do it. Get your clients to write their own manual, and also make sure that they use it on a practical basis. It's all well and good to have a manual that, the shiny, lovely manual that's this thick. If no one uses it, then it's a completely pointless document. So make sure that if you've got clients who are franchisors and they have manuals, that they're using them and that they understand the implications of not using them, and make sure that they're really covering off on what they need for the manual, and also that it adapts over time. I think that's another important point that a lot of people miss. This is not something that's set and forget. I didn't say that about the disclosure statement, but it should be reviewed, every 6 months or so. The same as the manual, it should be reviewed constantly, and you should get the input of the people who are actually using the manual to make sure that it's usable and that you can use it in the business. So that's all I've got to say on the manual. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, no, excellent comments for sure. Cool. All right. So the next slide, Jeremy, licensing. So as Jeremy mentioned, touched on it before about a license as competing against a franchise. So a lot of people might be tempted to go down the license path, and which is fine, except just be wary of if you're doing the license, then the moment that, or if you want to have any form of control over the person, then you're really a franchise. If you simply just going to give that to the third party and they can do what they want with the intellectual property that you're licensing to them, then that's a license. But the moment you start taking control, then you're flirting with franchise. So anything to do with marketing or any control over how that person runs the particular business, then you're going to be potentially up for a franchise, and there could be penalties. Most of the time it's probably going to come up if there's a dispute and the person that you've licensed the intellectual property to might say, I think I was a franchise, the franchising code of conduct applied, therefore all the good faith provisions, all the unfair contract terms, all of that stuff applies. And on that basis, you've breached all of that and you're up for all sorts of penalties and various other things. Or they might be able to terminate the license agreement, without a penalty or whatever it might be. So you want to make sure that if you're going to go down that path, that you're pretty strict on how you're going to run it. And as always, get the advice before you go about doing it, because it's very hard to start reversing things down the track. So make sure you get the advice, talk to the accountants, talk to the lawyers, and make sure you're not going to set something up that's got some potential issues with it down the track, because you don't want to have to pay some penalties and get in trouble with the ACCC or whoever else that might be chasing you. So definitely not something you just go about doing without really thinking about. If you want any control, then you're probably going to have to go down the franchise. It's obvious, at setting up a franchise and doing a license agreement, the costs involved are totally different, and that's why it's tempting to try to avoid the franchise model. And we've seen plenty of people that have tried to do it. We had one person that was keen on the license idea. We sort of counselled them against it. They ended up actually speaking to their accountant about it, who said, "Oh, look, I've had someone recently, do a license when really they were a franchise and they've got into some trouble over it." They gave the same advice that we were giving, and they went down that path rather than doing the license. So definitely something that pops up. And if it's a cost thing, you've got to weigh up the cost of setting it up against the potential costs of having an issue down the track if something happens and you've done the wrong thing. So as always with business, there's a risk versus reward, and you've got to make sure that you're not increasing the risk by reducing your costs at the beginning. But anyway, something to think about. As I said, you got any questions if someone's coming to you about licensing and franchising, you're happy to sit down and talk to them about it as well. Just ask some questions. All right, the next slide and the last one is common mistakes. So we've kind of touched on a few mistakes as we've gone along, but some of the ones that we've come up with for this slide are there's inconsistencies between your manual and your agreement. So it goes back to reading those sorts of things and making sure that they're correct and reading them together to make sure they're consistent. And if you are making changes along the way, as Jeremy said, making sure that they're reflective in both the agreements, the manual and the agreement, if they're there. With the manual as well, is not checking that it's comprehensive and actually works for the business. So that's obviously a big one. If you've got a manual there that leads everyone down the garden path that isn't what you want it to be, then you've got some major issues there. So you want to make sure that your manual is comprehensive and actually works. So as I said before, it's a pretty big job. Don't just do it and then expect it to be right forever. You need to keep looking at it. One of the other big ones with franchisors is you've got the manual in place, you've got your agreements in place, but you're not actually enforcing compliance with it. And if you don't enforce compliance the first time and let it go, then there's a course of conduct where the franchisee is allowed to continually not follow the manual or breach some form of the agreement. So it's very hard to start enforcing it once you let everyone do it. And then when other franchisees find out, Bob didn't have to do that, then they'll start doing it as well. So one of the main mistakes we see with franchise businesses is not enforcing compliance with these documents that you've spent hours, days, weeks compiling, and not enforcing the compliance for it. Because the whole point of it is to make sure it's consistent across the board. And the moment you start allowing breaches of compliance, then there's all sorts of weird things floating around in your franchise business, and someone's making a chicken pie and no one else is, and then someone goes to another business and says, I could get a chicken pie at Toogoolawah and I can't get one at Narangba. So you want to make sure that you're enforcing compliance, and as part of that, you're going to have your audits and processes in place that you're going out there and checking out the franchise. The last mistake that we wanted to touch on is making promises or any form of representation prior to or during the franchise agreement stage or during the training stage. So you want to make sure that they're not making any particular promises or representations, about profits or things like that, because for obvious reasons, if that doesn't stack up, then someone's going to complain that that you didn't get what you were getting represented to in whatever it is. So you've got to make sure that they're not doing those sorts of things, because recently they've changed the legislation about you used to be able to just get the franchisee to sign essentially a waiver saying, I didn't rely on any of these representations. They've watered that down a lot now, and you can't necessarily rely on those anymore. So it's very careful about what representations you do make, and what promises you make during that process. So as the franchisor, you want to be super careful. Obviously, you're trying to sell something, but you just make sure that you're making the right type of representations that aren't really specific about profit targets and those sorts of things. Or you're always putting a caveat on there by saying you do this, and this, then this should happen or whatever it might be. But be careful about making promises or representations. They're the main common mistakes with setting up a franchise and operating one. Jeremy, do you have anything else to add with the mistakes there?
Not with the common mistakes, Craig. I think you've covered them off well, and we did talk about them as we were going through. There's a lot to think about with the franchise, and I think that's really important for people to understand, and really for clients to understand too, because we get so caught up in what we're doing day to day with our businesses that we don't pay attention to these important things. So if you do have a client looking at doing a franchise, they've got to think of it as a separate business, and that's really key to their success. Do you have anything else, Craig?
No, I don't think so. Hopefully our accountants have got something out of it. And as I said, any questions, please let us know. There'll be the show notes, which will have the link to the template table of contents for the operations manual. So check that out. And
those show notes will be at businesslegallifecycle.com.au/064, because it's our 64th show. So sorry, cut you off, Craig, just to be clear, so people can see them.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing, except I forgot what show it was. So yeah, if you've got any questions, please let us know. Happy to help, as always. And I think the last slide should be up there with some of our details.
Taking the slide off, yeah. The slide with our details is on earlier, and we'll put them in the show notes as well, if people want to get in contact with us. All
right, I think that's it then. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to the next episode of the Accountants Partnership Plus. And if you're interested in the Business Eagle Lifecycle TV, we'll be back on Monday for Fast Fix Monday. This month we're talking about investing in property. So join us then if you're keen. If not, we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
See you next time. Thank you.